So the Moving Monuments project has been going on since 2022, and the idea of going into this topic of public portrait statues was something that Matthias and I started debating back in 2019. And that time, public portrait statues weren't that interesting, I think, maybe, not in Denmark at least. So we applied a couple of times for grants to kick off these ideas that we were developing on together. But we didn't really get any fundings until 2020, after the summer of 2020, when we saw these global actions taken up against statues all over the world. And some of these actions also reached Denmark, but in a different way. And it made us think about these kind of site-specific logics that revolves on these statues, but also how interesting it was to have this global phenomenon and then all of these very local grounded debates. So what we wanted to do with Moving Monuments was use the examples from the Danish context, but then in this international collaboration with other scholars from the rest of the world, trying to figure out how can we address some of these globally raised questions in regards to the local conditions that also defines these public monuments. So this is kind of what made us go into the topic, and then, going into this field, knowing a bit about the statues we have in Denmark, then going into the archival materials, it suddenly raised a lot of new questions. So what we thought we wanted to do at the beginning has also been taking us in new directions constantly. This has turned out to be a much bigger project than we actually, we knew it was interesting, but we didn't know that there was so much material to work with. So hopefully we can continue the project in different ways, because it's set to last until 2026, and then hopefully we can continue to develop on our research results. In recent years, monuments have become sites of heated and sustained critique, discussion and activism. The call of social justice activists to remove statues of colonizers and slave owners from university campuses and public squares gained momentum already in 2015 with the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa and the UK. In the USA, criticism of Confederate monuments also intensified after the white supremacist terror attack on a black church in Charleston in 2015. And in the summer of 2020, monument activism gained new global ground as the Black Lives Matter movement attracted international attention in the wake of the mediatized police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Actions against statuary monument is, however, far from a new phenomenon. As long as people have been making and raising statues onto pedestals, they have also been torn down, rematerialized, reused, recontextualized, or destroyed. Following the French Revolution, hundreds of statues depicting or representing the French monarchy were torn down and melted and used for firearms. And when the Soviet Union was dismantled, thousands of statues depicting Stalin, Lenin, and other high officials of the Communist Party were taken down and moved to new locations. Today, one may visit some of these statues in designated parks, where viewers can experience what was once towering monuments in settings that are much more down to earth. So statuary monuments have always been moving. So what made the demonstrations in the summer of 2020 different? The answer to these questions are many, but as I highlighted before, one that seems particularly important to stress is that this is something that's no longer just anchored in local communities. The monument storm of 2020 was the first time ever that we've experienced actions against statues on a global scale. Starting in the USA, the action spread to the rest of the world. Rooted in anti-racist and anti-misogynist movements, the statues were confronted, criticized, and in some cases taken down as figures representing suppression and white supremacists, which impacts on marginalized groups of people all over the world. Spurred on by social media platforms where images of toppled statues were circulated rapid and increased numbers, the movement spread from different locations in the USA and to the rest of the world within days. The monument debates also reached Denmark in June 2020, when activists dubbed statues of colonial missionaries and explorers in red paint, writing slogans such as "decolonize" on their plinths. But the discussion was quickly amplified after the activist group, known as Anonymous Artists, removed the modern plaster cast, or plaster replica, made by Jacques-François Joseph Sally. The original plaster cast was made by Sally in 1754, depicting the King Frederick V from the lecture hall of the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. Now, I should stress that this is not the original plaster cast made by Sally from 1754. This is a much newer plaster replica made on grounds of the original bust, but it's perhaps from the 1960s, 70s, 80s. So it's a much later replica, but no one really knew when it was pushed into the harbour, so it took quite a while before we knew what this bust was actually about. It was submerged into the Copenhagen harbour in an attempt to, and I quote from the statement made by Anonymous Artists on the media platform I Do Art, to articulate the ways in which the colonial era is invisible, but still has direct consequences for minority people inside and outside the Academy. While the uses and functions of monuments and memorials in everyday life have been central subjects of debate within fields including cultural history and memory studies since at least the 1970s, these examples on monument activism of the past decade has inspired a search of new art historical studies on monumental sculpture. While the empirical focus of this literature has privileged the monumental landscape of the USA, the theoretical and methodological perspectives in the field have been radically broadened, with studies focusing on topics including monument biographies, multidirectional theories of site, material history, everyday urban culture, racist cultural infrastructures, iconoclasm, and civic engagement, just to mention a few. And in the research project Moving Monuments, we see this current activist momentum and accompanying scholarly debate as manifesting what we call a new post-monumental condition, in which the monumental landscape has gone from having been relatively normalized and accepted in public culture to being marked by critical confrontations and call for change and reimaginings. Such post-monumental sentiments have occurred before, for instance in the aftermath of the French revolutions, as I mentioned before. And while the current mobilization around monuments differs in form and scope from the revolutions of the late 18th century, the activist interventions of the 21st century have problematized the long-held legitimacy and normalized presence of monuments in public spaces in radically new ways. So the post in the post-monumental does not signal a historical endpoint for monuments on whole, but rather it marks a new collective investment in re-evaluating the form and meaning of monuments, as well as their ideological and political functions in the past, present, and future. So defining what makes a monument in post-monumental times is therefore not just a question of analyzing statues on pedestals, meaning the figures on display in bronze and granite, but it's also very much a question that engages with cultural values, political priorities, and collective and personal privileges and positions. And this takes us to one of the cases that I'm going to speak a bit about now. On March 7, 2024, the day before the National Women's Day, the Danish Minister of Culture, Jakob Engel-Schmidt, declared that he was allocating an unspecified amount of Danish kroners to raising more statues in Denmark. The proposal entails mapping all existing statues dedicated to named women throughout of Denmark and formulating a list containing names of historical women who deserves a statue on a pedestal. The proposal has an impact as it addresses statues in all public contexts throughout all of Denmark. The Ministry of Culture has appointed 2 committees who will help formulating this monumental task. One committee will be mapping all existing statues, while the other committee will produce a list of women whom the municipalities throughout Denmark will produce new statues for. The project holds great potential. Each municipality in Denmark has traditionally authorized the production of figures of public commemoration on their own, and the processes of funding and organizing such initiatives are often treated behind closed doors. This new statue initiative is state-funded, and therefore it enjoys a lot of public awareness, demanding a level of transparency regarding the processes with realizing all of these new statues. This will hopefully generate a new degree of visibility, which will benefit the democratic debates around questions regarding permissions and maintenance of public statuary monuments. So instead of people deciding this in small committees behind closed doors, I truly hope that this initiative will shed some light on what is actually going on when statues are being raised. Statuary monuments have, together with other works of art in public spaces, been commissioned and planned by committees who are generally responsible for finding the artist and securing money and permission to raise the works, and perhaps most importantly also secure the ongoing preservation and maintenance. So it's not just about putting a statue up, it's also a question of what does it take to keep it on the pedestal, which I think is sometimes gets a bit overlooked in the public debates. These committees can take the opinions of the local communities into account, but they are not obliged to do so. Consequently, public statues have long been commissioned and raised in public spaces without consent of the local communities. This shapes an interesting paradox deeply embedded into how we talk about these statues in the public debates, because they are often perceived and framed as democratic ways of experiencing art within the broader public, as people do not have to enter, for example, a museum to view the works up close. Yet the infrastructure sustaining and enabling public art, including the stakeholders investing into producing, raising and keeping statuary monuments on their pedestals, has not been shaped by democratic principles. Instead, the infrastructure of statues and art in public spaces was constructed 100 of years ago during the late 17th and early 18th century. Since 1660, the Danish king had absolute power over his subjects in Denmark, which was inherited from father to son, and the first statuary monuments were commissioned and raised to commemorate this absolute monarchy by a narrow elite forming committees overseeing the projects. As such, the first statues raised in Danish public spaces commemorated the power of the king. I just missed my mark. Officially on behalf of his people, but in reality on behalf of those who benefited the most from this ruling system, meaning a narrow and wealthy elite. And until today, local communities cannot claim a public space for a statue without the approval of the local municipality. This is of course necessary, otherwise people would just go around and claim spaces for random pieces of artworks. Yet the system is far from transparent and it's difficult to navigate, making it also difficult to pinpoint why some statues go on public display while others are rejected. One such case where it's difficult to determine why the statue hasn't been approved for public permanent display, despite extensive support from local communities, is the statue I Am Queen Mary, made by Danish Trinidadian artist Jeanette Ehlers and the Trinidadian artist Lavonne Bell from the US Virgin Islands. The statue was initially conceived to mark the 100th year anniversary of Denmark selling the Virgin Islands to the US in 2017. The Virgin Island was sold in 1917. The statue represents the fireburn Queen Mary Thomas, one of the leaders of the fireburn labor revolt on St. Croix in the Caribbean in 1878. And the statue was raised in front of the West Indian warehouse in Copenhagen in 2018. Now, just to give you a bit of a background for the statue. In 1733, St. Croix had been purchased by the Danish West Indian Company, who exploited the land to establish huge sugar plantations. To grow and harvest the sugar, the Danish contractors purchased enslaved people who had been robbed from the African continent and forced into labor. For over 100 years, St. Croix was a sugar plantation where enslaved Africans worked the fields until they died to produce sugar for the Danish people and make the owners of the plantations immensely wealthy. In 1792, trade of enslaved people in the Danish colonies was prohibited, although this did not go into effect until 1802. From then on, the black population of the Danish West Indies were still working in the plantation under slave-like conditions, and even after emancipation was declared in 1848, former enslaved people of African descent found themselves forced into contracts that kept them working and living under inhumane conditions. Consequently, the Fireburn Revolt was an uprising against living conditions and involved burning down most of Frederiksstad town, as well as some of the sugarcane fields in the plantations. Mary Thomas led one of the revolts, together with Axeline Agnes, Elizabeth Salomon, Mathilde McBean, and Susanna Bottom Belly. All the women were arrested and shipped to Denmark in 1882, where they served prison sentences in Christianshavn's women's prison, before returning to St. Croix, where they are celebrated as the Fireburn Queens until today, while being fairly unknown in Denmark. I Am Queen Mary was raised in front of the West Indian warehouse in Copenhagen, where riches from the colonies were stored until the 18th and 19th centuries. The statue itself is a hybrid body printed from 3D scannings of the artist bodies. We only have the racist caricatures preserved of Mary Thomas herself, and the artists thus needed to think of a new way of providing the figurative statue with a body that could represent the strength and resiliency that she has come to be known for today. Sitting in the peacock chair, she holds a torch and a cane bill, the tools used by enslaved workers to cut the sugar canes in the fields. Finally, 1.5 tons of coral stones were imported to St. Croix to form the plinth, from the St. Croix to Copenhagen to form the plinth. These stones were cut by enslaved Africans and used in the foundation of many of the historic colonial structures on St. Croix. But the statue itself was made from polystyrene coated in various layers of sealants and paint to create an impenetrable surface. It was never cast in bronze. And during a winter storm of 2020, the head and torch broke from the statue, and the artists who were responsible for maintaining the monumental statue decided to take it down, leaving the plinth empty. The statue, despite referencing an important chapter in Danish history and portraying a woman of importance to Danish history, was never cast in bronze because it was never allowed to stay on display. While the artists gathered public support and the necessary fundings to have the statue produced, they still lack a license to raise the statue. And it's difficult to say why, but it surely exposes the opaque systems which operate the statue landscapes of Copenhagen and the rest of Denmark. The statue is clearly a much welcome addition to the existing statues inhabiting the streets, parks and public squares of the city, participating in addressing moments in Danish history which have an aesthetic and educational impact. As such, I Am Queen Mary cannot rewrite Danish history, yet it can affect how people, when looking at the statue, momentarily think about the past. And returning to the press release from the Ministry of Culture, the minister states that in Copenhagen alone, and I quote from him saying, "There are more statues of mythical creatures than of women," end quote. So we have more sculptures of mermaids than we have of named women in Copenhagen. This lack in diversity in the public figurative commemoration is truly problematic, as highlighted by the Minister of Culture when asking, and I quote again, "Is this really the image the next generation will grow up with? Especially when you consider how many crucial achievements in society are due to women. We all need role models to look up to, and who can give us an understanding of our shared past." End quote. Yet, the logics behind these statements also presumes a link between understanding the past and public statuary, which is interesting to explore in more detail. It is true that achievements accomplished by women have been notoriously overlooked in the writings of Danish history. While some women have received credit and acknowledgement, many have been forgotten, and sometimes women have been made invisible because their accomplishments have been credited to their male colleagues. Yet the reasoning behind the connection made between statues on pedestals and the perception, and perhaps more importantly, the remembrance of a shared past, is on more shaky ground. Following the logics behind the statement made by the minister, it sounds almost as if we would be able to add, or perhaps even correct, the Danish history by setting up statues of more women. And this harbors an age-old assumption made on behalf of statuary monuments, that the statues helps us remember people of the past by honoring them on pedestals. Yet this is not always the case. In fact, most people visiting the public squares and gardens in Copenhagen will have a hard time remembering all the men standing and sitting and pointing and addressing some imaginative audience. There is little in the generic commemorative format that makes us think about the actual people portrayed. Instead, the statues are easily overlooked when passing through on the way to work, picking up kids, or running errands. According to British journalist and author Gary Young, honorific statues are in fact lazy ways of commemoration. In a piece he wrote for The Guardian and published on June 1st, 2021, called "Why Every Single Statue Should Come Down," Young proposes that all figurative portrait statues should be removed from public spaces. In 2002, Young was invited to join the committee overseeing the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, London, functioning as a rotating space for exhibiting contemporary sculpture. On the fourth plinth, a new statue is regularly revealed, which has been left empty since 1841. Trafalgar Square was originally conceived to celebrate the British naval victory over Napoleon in 1805, and thus holds several honorific statues depicting British kings and military officials. Yet the statue planned for the fourth plinth was never realized due to a lack of money, leaving it empty for more than 150 years. And since the late 1990s, the plinth has been reimagined as a space for contemporary art, and a committee was formed in 2002. That same year, the Queen Mother, the former Queen Elizabeth, mother to the late Queen Elizabeth II, passed away, putting forth the question if she should be honored with a permanent statue on the fourth plinth. This raised a heated debate as people began to put forth other ideas for statues honoring British national icons such as David Beckham and Benny Hill. And no one could agree on whom to put on the fourth plinth, and thus Young posed a question to all petitioners putting forth the claim. If they could name the historic figures inhabiting the other plinth in Trafalgar Square, he would grant them the statue of their wishes. But no one could name the other statues. And Young thus posed a provocative but important question. So why would you want to put someone else up there so we could forget them? I understand that you want to preserve their memory, but you've just shown that this is not a particularly effective way to remember people. Returning again to the Minister of Culture in Denmark, this question of why we need more statues when we can't even remember those that already exist seems unanswered. But we may even push Young's question even further. In his thought-provoking 2021 article, Young addresses specifically figurative classical statuary, cast in bronze or carved in marble or granite, figures of commemoration which have been created with eternity in mind. Centering on figurative portrayals of named individuals, Young's critique of what he calls poor efforts of memorialization harks back at a quote by British poet George Gordon Byron, also just known as Lord Byron, stated around the time when he sat to have his portrait made by the Danish sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen. This was later published in his Detached Thoughts in 1828. In the quote, Byron ponders on the very concept of sculptural portraiture, and it goes something like this. I would not pay the price of a Thorvaldsen bust for any human head and shoulders, except Napoleon's, or my children's, or some absurd womankind's, as monk Barnes called them, or my sisters. If asked, why then I said for my own, answer that it was the request particular of J.C. Hobhouse, Esquire, and for no one else. A picture is a different matter. Everybody sits for their picture. But a bust looks like putting up pretensions to permanency and smacks something of a hankering for public fame rather than private remembrance. So what seems to trouble both Young and Byron, even though they exist in completely different worlds, many hundred years apart, is the eternal and monumental nature of portrait statues. Unlike a painting in a frame, statues in bronze and granite take up space. They claim authority, as Young puts it, to project the values of a given establishment into the future. But society will always change. And what then happens to the statues as they gradually fall into oblivion, outdated and no longer remembered or celebrated by society? To answer this question, we must also explore questions of aesthetics. Not wanting their works to fall victim to the same neglect like the classical statues, contemporary 21st century artists often grapples with the genre when commissioned to put up new statues. In the case of I Am Queen Mary, which was raised in polystyrene as a hybrid figure of the bodies of the two artists, Jeanette Ehlers and Lavonne Bell confronted the traditional genre by negotiating and reshuffling the materials and formats of the honorific statue, updating, challenging and questioning the imperial, colonial and patriarchal aesthetics embedded in the classical shapes of bronze, granite and marble. And while the statue still awaits its next material stage to be cast in bronze as soon as it is permitted, people can experience the monumental figure in an augmented reality. The presence of I Am Queen Mary existing across media and inhabiting not just the physical space in front of the West Indian warehouse, but also the public space that is online, makes it a fascinating case for how monuments of the 21st century may travel and morph between different materials and ways of viewing. Another public monument that reshuffles the genre is Monument for Inge Lehmann, made by Danish sculptor Elisabeth Torbro in 2017. The statue was commissioned by the University of Copenhagen and put on display in front of the old university building on Froeplads in central Copenhagen. It is the first public statue to a named woman in the history of the university, which is the biggest and oldest university in Denmark, traced back to 1479. So in 535 years, the university has commissioned statues and busts, paintings depicting men, but never one sculpture depicting a named woman. So the statue was, like I Am Queen Mary, historic on many levels. And Torbro was given the task of conceptualizing and sculpting the statue. And she chose to forego all formal aspects of the traditional figurative statue, and instead she created a monument to the academic legacy of Lehmann, commemorating her achievements as seismologist and geophysicist. Lehmann was educated in seismology in 1928 and spent several years studying earthquakes around the world. In 1936, when working for the Danish Geodetic Institute, she suggested that the analysis of P-wave data, that the Earth must have an inner core, which was an important breakthrough in the understanding of the nature of Earth's interior. Now, this is not my field of expertise, so please bear with me if I reference a research in simplistic terms. At this time, Lehmann's research was impossible to securely conclude on. However, in 1971, Lehmann's results were confirmed by computer calculations, and at that time she was 83 years old and long time retired. Her research made a major impact on research into earthquakes, and she has research named after her, and she was also instrumental in the creation of the International Seismological Center, collecting important information on earthquakes since 1964. Her research carries through into the monument created by Torbro in 2017. The sculpture is composed by a shaft carved from black granite, which is parted down the middle as if it had been struck by an earthquake. On top of the polished granite, zigzag lines follows the split rock from top to bottom, referencing the patterns drawn by the needle of the seismograph when it measures the movements of the Earth. Added to the side of the granite shaft is a model of the Earth itself. Half of the ore is cast in bronze, while the other half is a hollowed semicircle cut into the granite and decorated with a diamond-shaped pattern. Torbro used the classical materials reserved for honorific statues, bronze and granite, but shifted their usages as media for public monuments. Instead of making a figurative depiction of a named person from the past, in this case Inge Lehmann, Torbro used the granite and bronze to make a non-figurative celebration of her academic achievements. The monument has received harsh critique, mainly because it does not depict Lehmann herself. But Torbro added a portrait of Lehmann to the side of the granite shaft. Yet critics argue that this does not offer Lehmann the same level of visibility as all the other commemorative statues celebrating male bodies have enjoyed through centuries in the public squares of Copenhagen. And while such critique is right in claiming the need for making women's bodies visible, it is important to take ideas about aesthetics into consideration as well. Torbro was trained as sculptor at the Danish Academy in the early 1980s and has since then produced a wealth of public monuments placed all over Denmark. And she is one of the most talented and acclaimed contemporary sculptors in Denmark. And in Monument to Inge Lehmann, she demonstrates her deep insights into sculpting by drawing on the classical sculpture format to renegotiate ideas about aesthetics in relation to the very concept of the portrait statue itself. In Monument to Inge Lehmann, Torbro did not create a statue of Lehmann, rather she put all her knowledge and skills into updating the conservative statue genre and rethinking the aesthetics of commemorative monuments from a feminist and decentered perspective. Choosing to forego a figurative statue, the monument breaks with a 1,000-year-long tradition of celebrating the individual, centering them on pedestals, instead center the actual achievement and accomplishment which earned Lehmann a place in the Danish history books. The monument thus reaches beyond Lehmann herself to also include the academic communities to which she belonged and collaborated with to change the ways we explore and measure earthquakes. Monument to Inge Lehmann shows that it is necessary to rethink and not just reproduce the classical portrait statues when putting them on display. Remembering the statement put forth by the Minister of Culture in March 2024, there are more sculptures depicting fabled animals than there are statues depicting named women in the city of Copenhagen. And one statuary genre is particularly dominated by men, towering at the same time as the quintessential monumental portrait statue, which may also be one of the most conservative in its figurative expression. And that is the Christian statue. I will just finish off by some numbers on kings on horses from Danish contexts. The Christian statue was imported to Denmark in the late 17th century. with the statue of King Christian V at Kongens Nytorv in central Copenhagen, being the first to be raised in 1688. In this statue, we see the Danish king dressed in ancient Roman attire as a military commander, a strong and determined ruler who resides high above his subjects. The statue of Christian V was raised 20 years after the Lex Regia was signed, granting the king undisputed power. Since 1665, the Danish king was regarded by law as the supreme sovereign residing over the church as chosen directly by God to rule the Danish nation. No one at that time resided above him. The king had the right to issue laws, exempt whoever he wanted from the laws, appoint officials, wage war, and make or break alliances. And furthermore, the king had the right to levy taxes and to govern the church. All this power was inherited from father to son, from Christians to Fredericks. That's the name that keeps. It's either a Christian or a Frederick. To depict the king as undisputed sole ruler of the Danish nation, the Christian statue was imported. Performing as the ideal portrait format for a figure of absolute power, the monument raises the king high above his subjects, not just because he's sitting on a horse, but also because of the high plinth and the fence encircling the entire monument, creating an aura of importance and keeping a ceremonial distance to the subjects passing by. In the Christian statue, the king resides above everyone else. In real life, however, this changed with the Danish constitution that was signed by the king in 1849, defining Denmark as a constitutional monarchy, governed through a parliamentary system. The constitution separated the powers to rule the nation between the parliament, enacting the laws, the government, implementing the laws, and the courts which adjudicate them. Members of the parliament are chosen by the people. And in addition, the constitution granted a number of fundamental rights to the people of Denmark, including freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly. In sum, the constitution enabled democracy. Consequently, after 1849, the kings and queens of Denmark have become more symbolic in nature, having no real political influence over the state government. And one should think that the constitution brought about a new statue landscape, where equestrian statues depicting kings as sole rulers became outnumbered by new statues commemorating the people who are the foundation of a modern democracy. Interestingly, that was not the case. When the Danish king signed the constitution in 1849, there existed two equestrian statues in Denmark, the statue of Christian V in Kongens Nytorv and the statue of Frederick V in front of the royal residency at Amalienborg Palace. Following the signing of the constitution in 1849, Denmark, however, witnessed a boom in equestrian statues depicting Danish kings. In the following 100 years, from 1849 till 1955, there was raised at least 7 monumental equestrian statues, not just in Copenhagen, but throughout the country. Although the Danish kings officially handed the power to the people of Denmark, they continued to loom above them on tall plinths in much higher numbers than before. Should this increase in equestrian statues be seen as an expression of gratitude on behalf of the people? This may be true in the case of the equestrian statues raised in the 1950s, commemorating King Christian X, who had become somewhat of a national icon during World War II, when Denmark had been occupied by Nazi Germany. Yet knowing how the infrastructure of public monuments work, placing the power to produce, raise and maintain statues in small committees and closed councils, and not with the general public, this does not seem like a reasonable explanation. How then should this boom in equestrian statues celebrating Danish royalties when they had no actual ruling power be understood? And this will just take us to the final stop on the presentation. To answer this question, we must look to the Confederate monuments in the USA. Most of the statues depicting the military and political leaders of the Confederate Southern states were raised in the years following the American Civil War. The Civil War was won by the northern states, leaving the Confederate Union dissolved and claiming thousands of lives, and when fighting on the losing side, many of the men of the Confederate Army never returned to their homes. This left their wives, sisters, mothers, and daughters with the task of rebuilding society. And as a reaction to the great losses which they had endured, the southern states conjured this pseudo-historical negation myth known as the lost cause. Consequently, narrative shifted, and the men fighting in the Confederate Army had now died a heroic death to preserve the freedom to live their lives as they wanted, and not because they wanted to preserve their rights to own and exploit enslaved Africans. In support of the lost cause, United Daughters of the Confederacy, known as the UDC, with a headquarters in, where was it now? It just escaped my mind. I returned to this. They formed a patriotic society in 1894 in Nashville, Tennessee, becoming a driving force behind the hundreds of statuary monuments and memorials being raised throughout the USA in the 20th century. Commemorating Confederate soldiers, military leaders, and politicians, these monuments were raised not because they represented actual political power ruling the state government, but because they harnessed the symbolic powers of the statuary genre to claim a public space and control its narrative. The central UDC objective was not the monuments themselves, but to shape the general public notion about the Civil War and claim a Southern heritage. In addition, the UDC published a wealth of textbooks to circulate in schools. As such, public statuary monuments alone do not hold the power to shape history, but again, they can be seen as symbolic materialization of how the public should momentarily perceive the past and its place in the present. It was therefore no coincidence that a monument commemorating Southern General Robert E. Lee was raised in Rauenaki, Virginia, by the UDC in 1960, just after the local school allowed black children to enter the public all-white school system. The City Council of Rauenaki decided in 2020 to remove this monument, but it was soon after toppled and destroyed. Since then, the square has been named from Lee Plaza to Lax Plaza, commemorating, instead of Robert E. Lee, Henrietta Lacks, the African-American woman born in Rauenaki, whose cells are the source of the first immortalized human cell line. And a statue of Lacks was unveiled in the plaza on October 4, 2023. Raised in prominent spaces throughout the US, the Confederate monument stood as a testament not to the actual political ruling power of the nation, but to a social and cultural power that continued to commemorate a small chapter and very constructed version of the shared past of the people living in the USA. In similar ways, the Christian monuments of the Danish kings have been raised in all the major cities of Denmark to enact a symbolic power that does not need to align with the actual political power of the state government, but instead commemorates a very specific aspect of Danish cultural history. The power of public statuary to curate notions of a shared history is, as the Minister of Culture has also pointed to, far from innocent. In fact, the power asserted by statues deeply impact the ways we think about the hierarchies and ideologies guiding present-day society. But when public spaces throughout Denmark are littered with statues of white men, we need to be mindful as to what types of white men we are in fact looking at, by asking the fundamental question of why these statues were raised and by whom. Statues are signs of power because they claim a space in the public on behalf of someone else, but they are often raised during times when the basis of this power can be weakened or unstable, or perhaps even threatened by new changes in society. Contemporary interpretations of the genre, like I Am Queen Mary and Monument to Engel-Schmidt, performs as an update to a traditional monumental statue landscape by adding new figures to public spaces which align with the ideologies of the 21st century population. Seen against the statue storm of 2020, such updates and debates around them are surely necessary if we wish to continue making monuments for named individuals in the future. Thank you.